Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Uh, we are going to start with China, and after that, we are going to move to Brazil. Uh, our lecture structure is as follows. We are trying to look to the Chinese strategy of development, analyzing industrial policy and innovation policy in a broader perspective. So we are not going to analyze in details the innovation policies, the measures, and the instruments, but we are going to try to understand these policies as one of the parts of a major strategy of the Chinese development. So we first of all are going to take a brief look of the logical circuit of development. After that, we are going to look at the guidelines of the development strategy. We are going to try to understand some changes in Chinese industrial policy since 2000 to 2020. And after that, we are going to focus with more details on China-US tensions and the implications of these tensions to the Chinese strategy of development, and after that, some concluding remarks. First of all, we would like to emphasize that industrial policy and development in China is only one part, an important part, but only one part of the broader strategy of development that has the main goal to reach in 2049 the destiny of greatness of China, in our words. So it's something like the national rejuvenation strategy in order to put China again as one of the main superpowers of the world. How to do that, in our perspective, to avoid middle income trap based on a double confrontation. On one hand, Chinese economy is trying to be one of the leaders in the new emerging techno-economic paradigm, or trying to be at the frontier of the technological development. And there are lots of challenges on that, as we know. And on the other hand, the Chinese economy has some challenges posed by other emerging countries in order to keep them as the factor of the world. So they are trying to handle with this both challenges in two dimensions. What is, in our perspective, very different from previous developmental stage strategies of development as observed in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. What is the scenario? A very brief introduction. In order to achieve these goals, they have macroeconomic prices that are consistent with a strategy of long-term structural transformation. What I mean is basically exchange rates and interest rates that enable this structural transformation. This can be seen as, of course, that is only a starting point, but when we look to Brazil, we are going to compare this macroeconomic price, and we will realize that they are so easy to be achieved. So another point of the scenario, China use integration in global value chains as a tool for structural transformation. So the idea is to be in global value chains and use this integration as a tool to transform productive structure and to learn in terms of engineering, innovation, and etc. And not to be integrated in these global value chains as a desire that automatically will fulfill Chinese ambitions, as happened in other Latin American countries. The vectors of transformations are are two. First of all, the idea of capturing external dynamics by integrating in global value chains and using these revenues to foster domestic firms, to foster their learning and their revenues, and at the same time to use the power of socializing investment domestically to mobilize resources in order to foster structural transformation. So we have at the same time these two movements that coexist. We don't want to debate here if it is a export-led growth, investment-led growth, or a dual track system. We have to put all these features as an engine of structural transformation in China. And industrial policy, as we said, is just a part, an important part of this broader development strategy. Our hypothesis is that, unlike other catching up process, like canonical version of the developmental state like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, uh, in China, we can verify the coexistence of different stages of development. What we mean is that as China moves toward a more high-tech intensity economy, or as China moves toward more high-tech sectors, they do not deny the previous stage of development. So the idea is that heterogeneity exists in China. They are great. Maybe they are reducing. It depends on how we evaluate or what kind of heterogeneity we evaluate. But they are not understood as a barrier to the growth. Our hypothesis is that as one can verify the coexistence of different stages of development, Chinese matrix of industrial policy and institutions are able or are still being able to formulate policies in order to deal with this heterogeneity and use this in a functional way to the growth. Of course, that there are tensions, contradictions, and some challenges, but they do not deny or surpass the previous stage. We're going to be back in this point after. It's just an introduction. Some examples of this heterogeneity. When we look to low and medium low technology sectors, they represent almost two-thirds of value added in China. And when we look, for example, to textile and apparel sectors, they had in 2020s an export surplus of $389 billion, exactly the same amount of the or exactly as the same amount of the electronic and electrical equipment sector. So we have this kind of dual economy. We are going to present more data after. Third part of our presentation: understanding China's industrial policy. We have to look to different aspects that put some limits, constraints, and guidelines to this industrial policy. The first one we need to pay attention is the regional dimension and the experimentation. The idea is that the regions in China plays a central role in industrial policy because they have a large availability of resource. The majority of the research, on the contrary of the majority of people think, are not managed by central government. In the case of industrial policy, they are managed by the province or regions. So they have access to land and they have access to research in order to mobilize this research toward the directions of industrial policy that are created by national government. So we have to look to the regions and the competition among them. What we can verify in China is that these regions behave in a sort of fragmented hierarchy. What we mean, there are clear guidelines that came from the national government. We have to go to this direction and to in this intensity, but the provinces and regions, they follow these guidelines, but they adapt these guidelines to local realities because there is a higher tolerance for experimentation. So they are able to create local policies, local instruments, of course, according to the major guidelines, and to experiment new ways of implementing these policies. Once these policies are evaluated nationally and they have a good performance, they are picked and widespread toward the country. So there is a logic of extreme and fierce competition among provinces, among state-owned enterprises that are based on different regions, in order to show best performance. And this kind of coordination is based on the cadre system, as local leaders are evaluated by economic outputs, and as they want to be in higher position in the party, they need to deliver a good performance in terms of economic outputs, and this evaluation always change. How they change? They change influenced by the national government and by the guidelines. So if you want to move toward an innovation driven nation, the outcomes that are evaluated are different ones from the one you had when you were worried about creating the workshop of the world. So this cadre system that evaluate local leaders in order to reach higher position in the Politburo or in the party, they kind of align the guidelines. So there is a fragmented competition between provinces and enterprise that that strengthens the productive and innovative learning, but they are coordinated indirectly, not without some chaos in some cases, of course, but they are coordinated by these national guidelines. So this is one of the main important features of industrial policy in China. The other one is the heterogeneity of impact of international capital. When we look to China based on a Latin American perspective, we used to understand the country as able to deal with international capital and to use it as a tool for technological learning. That is true, of course, but in Chinese perspective, they think that that strategy that they call it market for technology was not enough, far from enough. So they have the perception that they have a greater share of international capital in their economy when compared to Japan and South Korea. And they have to deal with different impacts in different regions. So this international capital creates some constraints to Chinese industrial policy. These constraints are also related to local forces. So when we look to the bureaucracy in different regions, the literature says that in regions where multinational companies have huge projects dedicated mainly to exports in high-tech sectors, they historically, like Suzhou area, Zhu Jejin can correct me if it was Suzhou area, uh, they weren't so good in order to enable a transition to an innovation-driven strategy as Shenzhen area was, because even in the Chinese policy system, there is a kind of proximity of local bureaucracies with international companies that create lock-ins among them, since the local bureaucracy is evaluated by the cadre system. And if you have a huge multinational company that delivers a good performance in terms of exports, you don't need to move towards an innovation driven strategy because your outcomes are very well evaluated. So you are locked in and you have difficulties to change the paradigm, including in China, where it's very interesting to analyze the effects of international capital. Here's some data. Okay, the role of the not data, some features. The role of the SOEs. We always need to analyze the role of the SOEs, state-owned enterprise. In general, one can verify uh, a reduction of the share of the state-owned enterprise in the Chinese economy, what the mainstream literature used to call marketization. Of course, that is not our perspective. Despite this reduction of the share, we can verify the state-owned enterprise acting as the commanding heights of the nation, like driving the accumulation, driving the productive and innovative transformation in a broader sense. So they have multiple instruments of control and coordination that are aligned to the national guidelines, like the cadre system. Another very important thing is the competition among SOEs, among state-owned enterprise in region and nationally. So the idea is that there is, if we look based on a mainstream perspective, we could say there is a kind of a chaos and lots of inefficiency. Maybe it's true if we look to using the static perspective of efficiency. But on the other hand, we have lots of agents domestically in different regions that are in the same market and that compete fiercely among each others in order to achieve that national aims to foster innovation, productivity, and be positioned in national and global markets. And there is a kind of threat to all the state-owned enterprise. National government and local government always say you have to be number one, number two, or number three in your sector in the world. If you are not the number one, two, or three, you should be or you could be merged with other soil that has a better performance. So there's a kind of fierce competition that maybe is inefficient if we look in the very short term in a static perspective, and if we compare to the canonical developmental state strategy of Japan and Korea of avoiding social waste. But this competition creates strong actors to move toward a new paradigm. Uh, they are less diversified than when compared to the Japanese and Korean groups, also because of this competition locally, and also because of the competition with international capital locally. A very good example, when we look to automobile sectors, we have lots of municipal companies, but the major one is called SAIC, Shanghai Auto Industry Corporation. That is a local company that produces, manufacture more than the whole Brazilian auto industry. We're talking about Brazilian auto industry that historically was one of the majors of the world. So just one company, municipal company in China, has this scale. What means that they are creating capabilities to compete broadly. They have a higher degree of vertical integration when compared with other Asian counterparts. Another important feature of industrial policy is the role of the policy banks. They they are finance the broader process of structural transformation, of course, but they are also tied to the national guidelines of finance, innovation, and productive learning. How? Providing funds to the national champions and providing funds to emerging industries. So we could verify in the early 1990s a national guideline to this policy banks to provide research to 500 of strategic companies. 500 of strategic companies. So the national guideline was you should not cut or reduce or let this 500 of strategic enterprise without enough funds. So we have a very soft constraint on funds in order to invest. And these policy banks nowadays are also working in an institutional innovation that is the creation of industrial guidance funds. These industrial guidance funds are allocated in emerging tech areas in order to provide resources for startups and for other high-tech companies that are fighting for leadership in new emerging paradigms. The literature also says that there is an organization of the Chinese economy in different layers. So coordination and industrial policy is is fit in different ways according to different layers of the economy. So the Chinese economy has the ability to create instruments and tools in order to enhance the large state-owned enterprise competition broadly. The idea is to conclude the catching up, to modernize, and to be able to go abroad to have access to markets and research that are needed for Chinese development. They have different ways to deal with large local companies that are not state owned. The idea is to conclude the catching up, to foster engineer capabilities, and other different policies and instruments related to the technological based companies, as the one more related to the national innovation system being straightened, creating ubiquitous sources of of knowledge and putting them together in order to create platforms locally. So, on the contrary of what happened in Brazil, they are not tied to only one paradigm of industrial policy. Like the first one related to state-owned enterprise are much more related to local content, to subsidies, to the traditional old-fashioned industrial policy. When we look to the mid-term, they are much more related to the industrial policies that were observed in Japan, South Korea, that aims to avoid social waste and to mobilize research to provide investment and create capabilities related to this productive dimension. And the third paradigm, what is much more related to global value chains and new emerging paradigm, are much more fluid, much more diverse, and much more related to soft skills. Soft skills is not a good word, but was creation of dynamic capabilities in production and innovation that transforms itself very quickly. Some difference between Japan and South Korea. Our point is not Chinese industrial policy is not uh, the same as another case of developmental state, canonical developmental state as it was in South Korea and Japan. Of course, there are lots of features, but in China we can observe lots of difference. The first one is that they are trying to push the technological frontier, on the contrary of what happened in South Korea and Japan, that were just trying, just trying to catch up. So as China try to conclude its catching up, they do not, they do not deny the previous stage, and they do not aim to normalize or to westernalize their policy. That was the big mistake of the establishment globally, what my partner will talk soon. They bet that China would westernalize and normalize their policies once they conclude they catching up. And what is happening right now is exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. As they are trying to conclude the catching up phases, what China is doing, double, the, double the bet. So they are trying to move forward and to create a new paradigm of industrial policy, a new paradigm of industry in order to compete with this uh, global leaders and not to westernalize. Uh, so there is also an impossibility to concentrate exclusively on high-tech sectors. And another different perspective on China industrial policy is that as as China has a huge domestic market, they have agents with scale and capabilities to be potentially central players in the creation of new technological standards. So they not just want to compete in the consolidated areas, they want to compete in the new emerging paradigm, and they want to have a seat on the table and maybe to be in charge of the establishment of new technological standards. And why is that important? Because the one who controls the standards, the architecture, can capture more value in the global value chain. So these are one of the main differences, despite of the geopolitical reactions. We have also different interpretations about Chinese movement. Uh, on the contrary of what we talked here, we have Justin Lin vision interpretation that is based on neo structural economics. Uh, he is a very important Chinese economist, maybe the most important one, former president of the World Bank, advisor of Politburo. He always says that there is a gradual shift between activities of greater comparative advance. So he kind of denied this interpretation we had, and he says that Chinese catching up was based on not denying the comparative advantage, but using it in order to move step by step to a more innovative industry. So uh, they use low labor costs in order to integrate in global value chains, and they are not able to capture the majority of the value, etc., etc. Another different perspective is based on Peter Nolan, professor of Cambridge, that says that the technological gap is still large, learning is limited, and when we look to the major Chinese firms that compete globally, they are not, in his perspective, we don't agree. They're mostly based on traditional sectors like bank, finance, infrastructure, and they don't have enough capabilities to compete in new emerging paradigm. And the final different interpretation is uh, it's slightly different, based on Peter Nolan, Barry Naughton, sorry, interpretation that says that one cannot say that there was industrial policy in China before 2010, because his interpretation is that structural transformation cannot be understood in industrial policy, and industrial policy only exists when you have very target sectors. And before 2010, there were there was, sorry, a major transformation in all areas. So it is a technical definition, but in his interpretation, the results of this industrial policy post 2010 have yet to be evaluated, and maybe the Chinese are exaggerating, putting so much resources that can create inefficiency. So that's it. Now we move to the debate on uh, China-U.S. tensions.
Well, good morning for everyone. Professor Bruno was very generous in refer to our partnership as Lennon and McCartney. In fact, my role here in this presentation would be more like Ringo Starr. Okay. I guess my speech will be shorter than Antonio's. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here to talk about some findings of our joint research efforts and to talk about um, what we believe is the most important economic phenomena of global economy in this beginning, the beginning of this century. That is exactly the rise of China as an industrial superpower and increasingly as a technology and innovative superpower as well. Um, we can say that China is the major winner of globalization, as Antonio said, because China was able to promote a national development strategy that converged with the forces of globalization, especially the logic and the objectives of large global enterprises. They were able to attach a national strategy with the forces of globalization, like no other country did. And when we will show Brazilian data, we will see a very sad story when compared with the Chinese trajectory. But the recent years have been marked by an important change on this scenario, the scenario of globalization. And it means some kind of challenges, important challenges for the continuity of Chinese development trajectory. We can identify those challenges at the domestic dimension as well as at the external dimension as well. Domestically, we have what we call the end of cheap China, especially in regard to labor force prices, the salaries, the continuous raise of the salaries in China, and that took lead China to the end of this cheap China era. And of course, there are macroeconomic challenges as well associated with the real estate crisis. But at the external dimension, we believe that we have the major threats to to the continuing of Chinese development trajectory. The rise of geopolitical tensions, techno-nationalism, and restrictions on Chinese company, and as we will try to um, argue here, efforts to push the technological frontier, especially what is the so-called Industry 4.0. This is part of the rebirth of techno-nationalist development strategies on the major Western countries, with a set of policy associated with the view that technological and scientific development must be understood as instruments for the creation of economic and military asymmetries in an international system characterized by instability and permanent interstate competition. We are witnessing a widespread movement toward explicit industrial policy initiatives on developed countries that has the objective of reestablish the historically constructed hierarchy between nations about productive and technological leadership. And it is on this broader view that we understand the emergency of what they call Industry 4.0. What is Industry 4.0? We can start by saying what it's not. What it's not. It's definitely not an spontaneous phenomena, as some describe in the literature. It's not definitely a pure technological phenomena. And we believe that it's not even a real fourth industrial revolution as well. We're not denying that there are an important shift on the technology paradigm associated about the so-called Industry 4.0, but we just don't understand it as a new industrial revolution. It's a kind of a brand name that was created in Germany, and to label exactly the German industrial policy that was launched in 2011. It's a name created by the Henning Kagermann, I guess something like that, head of the German Academy of Science and Engineering. So, in other words, we see the emergency of that Industry 4.0 as part of the effort of the advanced economy to push the technological frontier, mainly in reaction to the Chinese rise and to the Chinese catching up movement. And so we will discuss here what would be the response of the Chinese strategy on this new environment. The hypothesis is so that Industry 4.0 must be understood as part of a broader context aimed to reconfigure the basis of inter-capitalist and interstate competition. This reconfiguration is key to reaffirm the technological and economic leadership of the main West economy, as well as the Japanese one, as the South Korean one, of course, and at the same time impose barriers on Chinese rise. Oh, what is that good old man doing in my presentation? maybe it's not that good. Of course, it depends on the comparison basis. Well, I beg you all pardon for putting this photograph here, this picture here, because it's not very scientific, is it? But I couldn't resist because uh, he just said those words, that statement, and it was exactly the idea I would like to bring here, because uh, what did he say? Huh? Let's read it. Biden warns China's economy is on the brink. He said this a few days ago, last month. Um, this is a prophecy that has been repeated at least at the 3 last decades, exactly the period of time when we witness it, the rise of China. They are always waiting for this imminent crash of the Chinese economy. So I brought here some questions. Why did the Western superpowers' reaction to China's advance took so long to happen? We believe that maybe it took too long, maybe it's too late. Will this reaction be enough to stop the Chinese advance? Two important questions. So that's it. We have recurring predictions that the Chinese economy will collapse at all those 2 or 3 decades in the past. Did they underestimate the Chinese development potential? And we have an hypothesis about this. Perhaps this reaction was delayed by the inability of Western analysts to understand the dynamics of Chinese economy. Our hypothesis is that for analysts of the mainstream economy, of the new classical mainstream, trained on liberal and neoclassical tradition, China would always be on the verge of collapse, on the brink, as said President Joe Biden. Because they understand that the Chinese system or the Chinese development strategy is artificial. It would be based on artificial state intervention, so it would be condemned to collapse. In fact, we believe that the dynamic of this Chinese economy do not fit into the conventional models of mainstream economists. We believe that we need other instruments and other concepts to understand the dynamics of the Chinese economy. What we believe is that, as Antonio just said, the Chinese economic system is a unique model with a unique capability of mobilizing instruments and resources combined with a high level of competence in design of policies aimed at long-term structural, and we would like to emphasize this structural transformation. That's quite important for us, especially. We're Brazilian, and here in Brazil, I guess more than 90% of everything that is said about economics or the economics debate doesn't focus on the aspects of structural transformation of our economy. the discussion here is monopolized by inflation target and fiscal policy. And when we look at the Chinese economic strategy, we see the structural transformation as the main objective of political economy, of the economic policy. Sorry. We don't mean to suggest that this economy is not facing a challenging situation nowadays, or even that this economic system is immune to the occurrence of crisis. We're not saying that they found a path to eternal prosperity. And in fact, recent times can be understood as the most challenging scenario since the beginning of opening and reform policies at the late 70s with President Deng Xiaoping. To understand how Chinese economy works, we believe that it's necessary to employ concepts associated with classical economists. The idea of investment socialization, that's the idea that is present at the general theory, John Maynard Keynes. We can identify those aspects, those characteristics on the Chinese institutionality, especially regarding to the National Development and Reform Commission, the SASAC, the State-Owned Assets Administration Commission, and the use of state-owned bank system and financial institutions as well. We can also identify some concept or some idea that refer to Joseph Schumpeter as understanding the Chinese economy as increasingly as an innovation-driven development. The idea that is quite well associated with Schumpeterian or New Schumpeterian economic theory. We can see a national strategy that puts the structural change at the priority of the policy as a path to economic development. And I will show here a little excerpt that is on this idea, and as well as ideas from Karl Marx, of course. And this was an idea that was explained recently by the President Xi Jinping at the second session of the 14th National People's Assembly. He used specifically this concept of new productive forces. Anyone here that are familiarized with the classical political economy knows what we are talking about, but it's specifically the Karl Marx Capital, the session 4 of Karl Marx Capital, bring us the meaning of what Xi Jinping is referring to this concept. The use of this terminology specific to the classical political economy, and more specifically for Karl Marx theory, in our understanding is not accidental. The establishment of an advanced material base is theoretically consistent with the stated objective of the socialist modernization proposed by the Chinese leader. So the Chinese response to this challenging scenario is to, as Antonio just said, to redouble its commitment to structural change of their economy. We can find some main aspects of this strategy. The dual circulation system or the dual track system, an expression that was coined, if I'm not wrong, at 2015, that brings the idea of focusing on the domestic market, that has nowadays a huge uh, uh, demand originated for this large medium class that China has made emerge, reducing the dependence from foreign markets and at the same time remaining open to the outside world. That's why we call them, or they call them, dual circulation system. And on the other hand, accelerating the construction of an economy based on indigenous innovations, especially at this since the beginning of this millennium, and since the 10th five plan, which is gradually enhanced through initiatives such as the medium and long-term plan for the development of science and technology and its numerous mega projects, as well as the following 5-year plans. And here we have some examples of important initiatives on that direction, and we would like to highlight some of them as most important. The medium and long-term science and technology plan, the Made in China 2025. We will talk about it more about it later. The Internet Plus and the innovation-driven development strategy national plan, the 5-year plan, and the artificial intelligence plan as well. We understand that this set of industrial and technology policies is guided by a broader strategy. Those policies are organized through a top-down approach and materialized in various initiatives that feed back into each other to reinforce China's innovation system while strengthening its productive structure. So what is the Chinese reaction? They as Antonio already said, they chosen this path because they understand that the technological complementarity with Western countries, and we could also say Japanese economy, or South Korean economy as well, would increasingly limit the development in key areas. So their strategy looks forward on strengthening industrial policy, especially because of the two major goals, the two major centuries, the consolidation, the objective of consolidation. I love this expression. It's so Chinese, isn't it? Moderately prosperous society. It's fancy. In Chinese, it would be something like 小康协会. They say that this expression or this idea is originally of Confucianism, but it's an idea that appeared in the Deng Xiaoping era. Was first proposed by Deng Xiaoping when of the process of the four modernizations. Then Hu Jintao as well referred to this idea uh, as uh, associated with economic policies intended to realize a more equal distribution of wealth. And of course, this idea is present at the govern of uh, Zhu Xi Jinping. The Chinese use this expression to refer to their president. It is Zhu Xi. Is that correct? Zhu Xi. That would be chairman. Brazil don't have a Zhu Xi. We have a Zongtong. And I asked my Mandarin teacher, just the president of China is Zhu Xi. And she thinking for a while, and she answered me, maybe Vladimir Putin is a Zhu Xi. But Lula is definitely not a Zhu Xi. He's a Zongtong. So the two centenary consolidating this moderately prosperous society, and that was the goal for 2021, and it's believed that it was achieved, and the long-term goal is to establish the country as an industrial and internet superpower, a global leader in sectors of high technological intensity by 2049, which is the centenary of the foundation of New China, or the People Republic of China. So we are talking about a development strategy that has innovation at the center. And so I brought this excerpt, extracted exactly from the National Innovation Driven Development Strategy. That was one of that initiative that we had on the table. I love this. This is a translation that is available at Georgetown University of this policy document. At a critical stage in China, accelerated advancement of socialist modernization and its realization of the two centennial objectives establish a well-off, the well-off would be the moderator, prosperous society, in an all-round way by the centennial of the founding of the CPC, the Chinese Communist Party, establish a rich, strong, democratic, civilized, harmonious, modernized socialist nation by the centennial of 2049 of the founding of the People Republic of China, and of the Chinese dream. Chinese dream is a term that is also referred by Xi Jinping. The Chinese dream of the great rejuvenation of Chinese nation, and it's necessary to steadfastly maintain that. To grasp innovation is to grasp development. The boldface is mine, okay? And to seek innovation is to seek the future. This is what we find at the official document of this initiative. How this industrial and technological policy is materialized. We chosen some main important aspects. By building, by financing R&D centers on specific technology. We have more than 40 national R&D centers created by this policy, with important state participation in laboratories and public research institutes to promote general purpose technology and development technology still that is still on their gestational period. Um, Significant amount of resources, of financial resources, and this has to do with that idea of socializing investment, the ability or the capability of use this uh, funding resources because of the public character of the Chinese banking system. That's a unique aspect of the Chinese economic system, as well as by a China Development Bank, Export and Import Bank, and Regional Bank as well. And some important institutional innovation, the creation of the Industrial Guidance Fund. This seems to be a quite important institutional innovation of recent times to finance innovation on private companies, mainly with resources funded by state-owned enterprises. And here we have some figures, some graphics that shows the rise of those resources at this funds, and the fact that most of these funds are originated from provincial and municipal sources, and great part of them are directed to high technology, sector specific, and high tech industry, diversified high tech industry, as well as advanced manufacturing and industrial upgrading. All those are related to what we can call in a broader sense industry 4.0. Other aspect of the materialization of industrial and technological policy in China is mergers and acquisitions, takeover, especially of assets abroad. Not all of them were well succeeded. Some of them were blocked, as we show on this tape. Yes. Establish of R&D centers abroad as well, the use of public procurement, public purchases, financed by large banks and coordinated by the state-owned enterprises and the SASAC, local content goals, strategy of import substitution, and this is the essence of the so-called Made in China 2025. This figure shows what they planned to do in the Made in China 2025 in terms of internalizing and substitute imports. Now some advertisement. If you would like to read a good paper on this subject, we could recommend this one. Written by John Leno and Ringo Starr. industrial policy, techno-nationalism, and industry 4.0. It was published last year in the Brazilian Journal of Political Economy. In this paper, we try to analyze this reaction of the Chinese technological policy uh, uh, related to the emergency of the so-called Industry 4.0 uh, by trying to identify what are the major technologies involved in this new paradigm. And we found here three different uh, layers uh, and some technologies that pervades all those three layers, specifically big data technology and artificial intelligence technology. And then you can read the paper if you want to more details, but we analyze each one of these layers and these technologies, trying to identify advantages of the Chinese structure and the Chinese industry, as well as some disadvantages and the agents that are enrolled on those different layers. So you can pass it more fastly. And then we uh, do it by each one of the layers, trying to identify the advantages and disadvantages and agents, so on. I guess that's enough. And thank you all for your attention. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, c'est chouette.
We apologize for presenting Brazil very briefly, but it was our goal. Our main conclusion is that, in general, Brazil and China, as everybody knows, have different or almost opposite paths of development since 2000s. So the idea is that Brazil have experienced a premature deindustrialization, a very strong one maybe one of the most intense in the world, while China, as we have seen, is doing very well in its catching up and development strategy. So the idea on this lecture, we try to bring some brief historical background on Brazilian industrialization, present the crisis for the one that are not Brazilian since 1980s, and the rebirth of industrial policy uh, in 2000s and the new rebirth on 2024 and its limits. So the idea is that, very briefly, Brazil used to be a successful case of industrialization since mainly 1930s to 1980s. So there was the idea that Brazil could be understood as a kind of was some exaggeration by being Brazilian of a blueprint to other emerging countries. We have lots of anecdotal aspects of policymakers from Japan, South Korea, and even China. Even China came into Brazil at the late 70s to learn was our industrial policy and our strategy of development. Of course, there were lots of problems related to the heterogeneity, to the perverse model of growth, etc., etc., etc. But the general trend was understood as a very strong and fruitful movement of structural transformation in what we call literature called developmentalism era. So it was based on import substitution industrialization, based on the idea that we could create a model that combines state-owned enterprise, multinational companies, and national private firms, sorry. They were committed to together foster structural change with well-defined roles. That's a problem because the role uh, designated to Brazilian companies was a complementary one, what created a past dependence towards low development in technological and productive capabilities and enhanced our dependence on multinational companies, exactly on the contrary of what happened to China. So one of the main aspects is that we, at least since after President Getulio Vargas maybe could have the same label of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. uh, we never tried to control the international capital, even in Juscelino Kubitschek. So the idea was to bring international capital and to create industrial policy to foster local content. These policies were good. We have good results, despite of some limitation, but we never created strategies to control the capital and to use this local content as a driving force to create new capabilities when we expect a change in the paradigm. So that create a kind of locking that conventional industrial policy based on infant industry, protectionism, subsidies, local content, and below market interest rates. These were good policies and traditional policies at the moment, but they were not enough to enable a transition. So we had an immature innovation system and a low level of innovative capabilities due to these policies, but mainly due to the constraints created by the presence of multinational companies leading this movement of industrialization. So that's our interpretation, not our, but interpretation of the majority of developmentalism literature in Brazil. We had a crisis for the one that are not Brazilian of developmentalism in 1980s related to the debt crisis, and we didn't have since then until 2000s. We can debate that, but space for fostering again the process of structural change. We had high instability in terms of inflation rates, economic instability, financial instability, and we had at that moment, mainly at the 90s, the idea, the prevalent convention in the world, except in Asia, but mainly in Brazil and Latin America, that the best industrial policy is no industrial policy. So the idea was that we should enhance privatization and trade openness in order to enhance competition, efficiency, and to create a path to growth. So there were these were elements of an automatic, a natural strategy of development, a liberal strategy of development, where industrial policy was denied. After that, in the early 2000s, 2003, with President Lula, we have an attempt of rebirth of industrial policy. 2003 was PITSI, or Industrial, Technological, and COMEX policy. The idea was to create uh, dynamic capabilities in national economy. We designed this policy based on a Schumpeterian assessment of our economy. So it was an attempt to modernize institutions, to create new way of coordination, and to create new policies that were more suitable to the new paradigm. The problem was there were few resources, and they were much more related to some innovations in institutions and laws, like innovation law, innovation incentives law, etc. They did a good job, but in a scenario of very wrong macroeconomic price, high interest rates, uh, low exchange rates, we could not foster the investment, and we also didn't have the local agents as China, local firms, to implement these policies at the level we want. So we had to deal with the heritage of building an industrialization based on multinational companies. When we tried to move toward a new paradigm, we don't have we didn't have the agents like the state-owned enterprise in China, or the private one, or the local state-owned in China. So we are dealing with institutional change, with some instruments, with few reserves, with wrong macroeconomic prices, and the lack of agents. So how to foster this transition? It was exactly the opposite that we observed in China. It happened again in 2008, when we had the productive development policy in government Lula. The idea was more related to a contra-cyclical policy in order to enhance investment growth. But we had in this policy the idea of creating national champions that were not enough. Our criticism about that is not that we shouldn't create national champions. We should be able to create more national champions, and in different areas, not only in the areas related to comparative advantage or stack comparative advantage. We did very well in that areas, but we lack some efforts, and we had to deal with constraints in order to create new national champions or regional champions in more technological related areas in order to foster uh, this transition. So we had again the bigger Brazil bigger plan 2011 was former President Dilma Rousseff, with the idea of wrong perception. We realized that after that we should reduce the costs of investment, and so in a way that one could think related to a trickle down economics, the firms would invest more and Brazil would take off. We had some problems with that related to the behavior of the firms, but in our interpretation, this behavior should be expected because there is a phenomenon we call Brazilian disease that is related to a different way Brazilian firms were able to compete locally and to enhance their accumulation. So we are going to talk about that after the break. Uh, so concluding the limits, the first broad limit is that we had institutions and policies. We had three major limits. I will talk about two now and conclude in 2 minutes. One, institutions and policies locked in into the previous paradigm. So uh, it's very difficult to overcome this kind of locking. So we use it to be very good in creating policies related to local content, subsidies, protectionism, and fostering investment. These are good policies, used to be better than now because we are talking about a different paradigm in industry and competition. So we weren't able to create new institutions as China and policies more suitable to the new global value chains area and to the new way of competing based on dynamic capabilities. And the second limit is that we didn't have the same characteristics as canonical developmental state has. Just to name one of them, we don't have a very strong bureaucracy. We have a strong bureaucracy, but that has no autonomy to implement this policy because we are tied to this long-term view of liberalization in Brazilian economy. We are always having to explain and to convince even the entrepreneurships that industrial policy is good and relevant. We have to convince them. We have to convince the public on public debate. We have to debate with the Minister of Finance, etc., etc. So it's very difficult to be effective in this context. We do not have higher power of state coercion as we used it to have. Coercion is a strong word, but to be more able to coordinate and to be effective. So it's a problem. We don't. We have a very high penetration of international capital. Is that the problem? It depends on how you control or you do not control them. So if you do not control international capital, how you can create constraints for them to develop local technology. And we don't have finance subordinated to production. So we have wrong macroeconomic prices that are not suitable for a long-term strategy of development based on innovation. So these are the two constraints. After the break, I will talk about the third one.